1689 The Haunting of Hadlow House. Chapter 2 The entrance hallway of Hadlow House had stood in complete silence for several weeks before, finally, a key was heard scraping in the lock. After a few attempts, the door shuddered slightly before creaking open to reveal a woman silhouetted against the forest outside. This woman hesitated for a few seconds, staring into the darkness, before turning and looking back across the clearing. "There's so much dust," she called out. "Oliver, there's absolutely no way that this house can be ready in time." She watched as her husband made his way out from the forest carrying some large twigs and branches, which he threw down onto the forest floor. After stopping for a moment to reach around and touch the small of his back, he set off again, heading toward the bottom of the steps and finally looking up at his wife. "Come off it, Fanny," he said with a pained smile. "You'll work your magic just like you've always worked it in the past." "When Mr. Hadlow employed you when Mr. Hadlow employed me," she replied, cutting him off. He failed to describe the total sum of the work he expected. "He told me that the house would merely need to be opened up again, but instead it's going to require a full clean." She let out a tired sigh. "He and his new wife are due in a matter of days," she continued, "and I truly don't know how I'm going to have everything ready for them." "But you will," Oliver pointed out with a wry smile. "You always do. Meanwhile I must deal with the land, and let me tell you that this place is thoroughly overgrown." There's no stopping. Suddenly, he peered at his wife. She waited for him to answer, although after a few seconds she realized that he was looking not at her but past her. She turned and followed his gaze, but all she saw was the house's gloomy staircase and a window at the top looking out toward the tops of more trees. "I'm sorry," Oliver said, shaking his head, "it was nothing. I just thought." He sighed, before turning and heading back toward the twigs and branches. "My eyes are playing tricks on me in my old age," he complained. "I shouldn't grumble too much, though. There are plenty who have it worse. And at least I have some work to be doing, for Mr. Hadlow not only wants the forest cleared a little in the house's vicinity but he also wants me to see what's fouling the river. You're not the only one who has their hands full, Fanny. Not by a long shot." Fanny opened her mouth to reply to him, before stopping at the last moment. She knew there was no point arguing with her husband, and besides she supposed that there was no time for much talking. After glancing briefly at the large oak tree, she turned and stepped into the dusty hallway. She looked up at the top of the staircase, just to reassure herself that her husband had seen nothing untoward, and then she began to make her way through to the pantry while muttering complaints to herself under her breath. At the top of the stairs, there was no sign of any movement, nor was there even the slightest hint of a breath. The carriage bucked and rumbled over a particularly rough stretch of road, and Richard, after a few hours of silence, turned to look over at his new bride. "The roads become less smooth once we are out of London," he observed, hoping to perhaps start some conversation to pass the time. "I don't know if you've left London before, but things are a little different out here. Still, the world would be a boring place if everywhere was the same, just as it would be boring if every person was the same. Sometimes I think that differences, far from being a cause of separation, can actually unite people." She turned to him, and he was immediately struck by the glare in her eyes. In the week since they'd met, and the 5 days since their marriage, Rebecca had barely said 2 words to him. He tried very hard to break through and at least make her laugh once or twice, yet so far she seemed absolutely determined to prove her anger at every moment. Although he understood that she was perhaps not entirely happy about the situation, he couldn't help wishing that she might at least endeavor to make an effort. "The air is very clear out here," he continued, trying to think of a few more positives. "If you're interested in the natural world, there are several species of I'm not," she said abruptly. "I see." They rode on in silence for a moment longer as Richard tried yet again to think of a pleasant topic. He felt sure that he could win Rebecca around if only he found the right way to her heart, and he told himself that he merely needed to surprise her a little. At the same time, he quickly reminded himself that eventually they would be stopping for the night, and that perhaps at the inn he might have a little more success. After all, the bumping carriage was hardly conducive to any kind of relaxation. Satisfied that he was correct in this estimation, Richard turned and looked out the window, admiring the beauty of the Kent countryside. He felt sure now that, as soon as they reached the inn, they would get along much better. The door slammed shut in his face with such force that Richard instinctively took a step back. "I shall be downstairs, then," he said, hoping that Rebecca might be able to hear him still from inside the room. "If you would like to come down later, I'm sure we could." His voice trailed off as he realized that the evening seemed unlikely to go his way. With darkness having fallen outside, he supposed that he must simply find something to eat and then retire for the night, although part of him still clung to the hope, however faint, that he might yet be able to talk Rebecca round. He understood that she might be a little reluctant to start a new life with him so far from her old home, but he felt sure that she must be wise enough to realize that any young woman of marrying age must eventually settle down. He also knew that his new home could not fail to impress anyone. "Wait until you see Hadlow House," he said, trying to sound confident. "It's really rather magnificent, even if I say so myself." He waited, and he felt sure that she must be able to hear him, even if she was not yet predisposed to reply. "You'll settle in there so very well, I promise," he continued. "Why, I'm sure that many young women would be desperate to have such a beautiful home. It's light and airy, and I've had Mrs. Baxter and her husband go on ahead to open it all up, so you won't have to get straight to work. Did I tell you about the Baxters, by the way? They've been a godsend to me, truly they have. I don't know where I'd be without them. Mrs. Baxter tends to domestic matters and her husband Oliver deals with the garden area. Well, that's how things worked when they were employed by my father, so I'm sure it'll be the same now that." His voice trailed off for a moment as he realized that he was straying into potentially uncomfortable territory. "So you won't have the full set of domestic work to do at all," he added. "Isn't that good? You'll have a lot of time for things like sewing. Do you like sewing, Rebecca? You seem like a very creative and imaginative young lady. If you sew, I would very much like to see the things that you get up to and—" Again he found himself struggling to finish a sentence, and he worried that he might actually be making things worse. Should he not, he realized now, simply let the poor young lady sleep so that she might be refreshed in the morning? "I shall be downstairs, then," he said somewhat uncertainly. "I was hoping to share the bed with you tonight, but I wonder now whether I should ask if there is another room available. There's no sense in us crowding one another so soon into our marriage, is there?" He waited, and after a moment he realized that a faint sound was now breaking the silence. Leaning a little closer to the door, he thought at first that Rebecca might be laughing, but he understood after a few more seconds that she was in fact sobbing. He opened his mouth to call out to her, yet he knew that there was nothing he could say that might set her at ease. She would simply have to come around to his way of thinking and eventually realize that she was actually rather lucky. "I shall see you in the morning, then," he added, forcing a smile even though he was entirely alone on the inn's landing. "Yes. In the morning. Lovely. I shall look forward to the rest of our journey together." Chapter 3. That oak tree's not looking too good, Oliver Baxter said the following morning as he made his way through to the kitchen at the rear of Hadlow House. "I'm starting to wonder whether it's dying." Stopping in the doorway, he saw that his wife Fanny was standing at one of the windows and staring out toward the trees. He waited, convinced that she had perhaps simply spotted a fox or some other animal, but he realized after a few seconds that his wife seemingly had no idea that he was even in the room with her. He took a moment to clear his throat, and then when even this failed to attract any attention, he made sure to walk heavily and loudly as he crossed the room. "Fanny," he said, before reaching out and touching the side of her arm. When letting out a startled gasp, she turned to him. "I didn't mean to scare you," he told her, although he couldn't help but smile. You're not usually this jumpy. What's wrong? Nothing, she replied, shaking her head. It's just that Mr. Hadlow will be here later today, and there's still so much to do. The last thing I want is for his new wife to think that I'm in any way unreliable as a domestic helper. No one in their right mind could ever think that, Oliver told her. I must admit, though, you seem to be not quite your usual self since we got here. Could it be that there's something on your mind? He watched her face closely, and he knew his wife well enough to understand that he was getting close to the truth. It's this house, isn't it? He continued. Fanny, I noticed before that you seemed to become rather fearful whenever this house was mentioned. Don't you remember that I suggested we could look for other positions? Just because we served Mr. Hadlow's father, that doesn't mean we have to always stay with the same family. I can't imagine what you don't like about our present situation, but I'm still willing to consider a move. You must say so soon, however, otherwise matters will become more difficult. A move? She replied, as if the idea was foolishness itself. We can't possibly move. What possesses you to say such a foolish thing? I'm only trying to help. You can help by not getting in my way, she said firmly. Are you finished outside, or do you have more work to do? Remember, if he's made good time then Mr. Hadlow could be here at any moment. I'd better inspect that tree some more, he sighed, turning and heading out of the room. I only came inside to see if you need any help, but evidently you've got everything under control. I might have to talk to Mr. Hadlow about doing something with the oak tree, though. There's going to come a point at which it's unsafe, and if he's set on having children then obviously. He continued talking as he walked away, but his voice drifted off until he could no longer be heard by Fanny in the kitchen. For her part, she'd stopped listening to him long before he'd even left the room, and instead her focus was entirely on the window. She was not, however, looking at the trees outside, or at the garden, or at the gray sky above. Instead, she was staring at her own very faint reflection in the glass, and she was watching for any hint that an unseen presence might be watching from over her shoulder. A few miles away, following more silence during breakfast, Richard and Rebecca sat in the bumping, bouncing carriage without speaking. Every so often Richard spotted something out the window that he thought he might remark upon, yet each time he held back. Truth be told, he was starting to find the awkward one-sidedness of the conversations rather uncomfortable, and he'd begun to wonder whether silence might actually be preferable. At least for now. Once they arrived at the house, however, he felt sure that Rebecca would start to come round. Spotting a magpie, Richard opened his mouth to pass a comment, but the bird quickly flew out of sight, and anyway there was no guarantee that Rebecca liked such things at all. Is the house big? She asked suddenly. He turned to her, and he was immediately struck by the fear in both her eyes and her voice. It is, he told her, before correcting himself. Well, by some standards, at least. There are 3 bedrooms, which seems more than generous. 3 bedrooms, she replied softly, before turning to look straight ahead just as the carriage passed over a particularly rough section of the road. That is good. 1 for us, Richard said, trying to hide the fact that he was gladdened by her words, and then, I thought I should plan ahead for a family. He saw her flinch, and while he knew that he had every right to simply demand children soon, he couldn't help but wonder whether a more cooperative approach might be better. You are of childbearing age, he pointed out, hoping to cheer her up. Her lips moved slightly, but no words escaped. She seemed deep in thought, and Richard realized after a few seconds that there was almost an element of panic in her gaze. For a moment, he actually caught himself wondering whether she might out of sheer desperation fling herself from the carriage. He quickly focused, however, on the idea that this type of thinking was completely foolish. How far is the house from any neighbors? She asked. I have purchased a large tract of land, so there is no danger of us being interrupted on a day-to-day basis. He waited for her to smile. I thought that would make you feel better, he added. We can create our own little world at Hadlow House, one in which we are entirely the masters. That way, we can focus on what is really important and we can build our family together. I don't know how much attention you pay to events in the country, Rebecca, but in recent years there has been a great deal of turmoil. My own family has suffered very much during this period, and I believe it is better for a man to keep his family protected from outside events rather than. Well, I believe that a man must look after his family, that is all. I hope that you agree. Is there a town or a village nearby? Cobblefield is close. Within walking distance? Within 10 miles, so that would take 4 hours. Perhaps. There really would be no need to undertake such a journey, he told her. Mr. and Mrs. Baxter will perform most of the necessary tasks, leaving us free to focus on what's truly important. Is Cobblefield large? It's a village, he explained. There cannot be more than 300 people living there, of that I'm sure. The place would most likely be a culture shock for someone who has grown up in London. 300 people, she whispered, as if she was in awe of that number. How can they live so far from the rest of the world? Do they not feel isolated? There is nothing wrong with a little isolation from the chaos of the modern world. How do they not lose their minds? I imagine they would ask the same question of those who live in London. He paused, before reaching for her knee, and then at the last moment thinking better of the idea. He wanted to touch her, the way that a man should touch his wife, but he worried that she might become startled. He kept his hand close to her knee for a few more seconds, and then he pulled back. You will get used to this new life, he said firmly. Your father was convinced of that. Why, one day you might even be thankful that you came here. She turned to him again, and now the fear in her eyes was if anything more pronounced than before. In that moment Richard realized that his new wife was looking at him not as a husband or a savior, but more as a kidnapper. He quickly told himself, however, that this was wrong and that he was allowing his imagination to run wild. Finally, unable to look at her for even a moment longer, he turned his gaze so that he could instead see the passing forest. We will be at the house soon, he told Rebecca, convinced now that the sight of Hadlow House would fill her heart with joy. I rather sense that you will feel a lot better as soon as we are at our new home. Thank you for listening to your daily dose of creepiness. If you enjoyed the story, make sure you subscribe, like, share, and push that notification bell. Check us out on TikTok for short stories.